Okay, so we're going through Judges today, looking at the book of Judges. We just finished up Joshua. And as we finished up the book of Joshua, when we come to the end of Joshua, remember how when we started the book of Joshua, remember how it begins, they're coming into the promised land. And remember how the priests with the Ark of the Covenant step off into those flooded waters of the Jordan, and the water rolls back, and the people of Israel cross on dry land. It's very symbolic of Moses. It's like God is putting His stamp of approval on this replacement for Moses, this next chosen man being Joshua. And what we see at the end of the book of Joshua is Joshua, he's learned from his mentor Moses, and he speaks like him. And what he does at the end of his life, we've taken the promised land, we've divided it up among the nations, the tribes of Israel, and Joshua calls the elders together and speaks to them of all the tribes and gives them a commission to kind of reunite themselves under the covenant of God, just like Moses had did. So before Joshua dies, he does the same thing. Those famous words where he said, "Choose you this day whom you will serve." He tells the elders of Israel this. He says, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And he actually makes them, and he tells them God is a jealous God, He's a holy God, and we should follow Him. He said, let's not worship the gods on the other side of the river. And he said, "Choose you this day." And all the people said to Joshua, "The Lord our God we will serve, and His voice we will obey." So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day. He's renewing that covenant. He said, "I'm going to hold you to it." And they said, "We'll be a witness to ourselves. We promise that we're going to follow God." And what we see is right at the end of as he dies, as Joshua dies and is buried, it said Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of those elders that even went on to outlive Joshua. That's exactly what they did. They served the Lord. But if we go over to Judges, in the book of Judges chapter 2, around verse 10 and 11, right in there, we're going to see a new story. It says basically in those two verses, after those they served the Lord all their time. They really held to their covenant. But after those elders died, there arose a generation who knew not the Lord. And so that very next generation, it says the people did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They abandoned the Lord, that very next generation, and started following after the Baals and Ashtaroth and all that, and the people of the land. And so what we're going to see is that they forgot to tell the next generation. Those elders followed God and attended to His covenants, but they forgot to tell their kids and grandkids just how important God was to them. It says they knew not the Lord. They weren't being told the stories so much as seemingly as all the miracles that had happened in their lives. They forgot to pass on this knowledge. And so as we go through Judges, we're going to see something happen that's kind of a mess as sin enters in. And I wrote up here on the board, I have this written up here. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 7, God had said He commanded Israel to destroy their enemies when they entered the promised land. Remember, we've been through all this, we've talked about it before. God commanded Israel to destroy their enemies when they entered the land. And in verses 3 and 4 of chapter 7 of Deuteronomy, He gives the explanation of why you're to do this. And it's because these people were wicked and their evil ways. He said, if you follow after them, you'll follow after their gods. Don't marry into their families. Don't be a part of it. Just get rid of them. This is what you're to do. And if we start out in the book of Judges, chapter 1, what we're going to find is, Joshua has been in with the armies of the Lord. They came in together as a group, divided off and conquered those large nations that were in Canaan. And then they separated out by each tribe. Each tribe was separated out and had their own land. And then they were supposed to go ahead and carry it forth themselves. Ask your neighbor if you need to help you, if there's somebody there. But you're to wipe out, do what God commanded, destroy your enemies. But what we see in Judges chapter 1, I put here in Judges 1, verse 1 and 2, and then down in 19, talks about the tribe of Judah. Just example number 1. Tribe of Judah, they defeated the enemy of the mountains, but they didn't trust in the Lord to defeat the enemy in the lowlands. They failed to defeat the enemy. So they allowed the enemy to live where they were at in this land of Judah. And so you go down to still chapter 1, go down to verse 27. Manasseh did not drive out the enemy in their land. They allowed them to live. in their land. We don't know the reason completely why they done this. Maybe they were around them for a while and they decided, they're not so bad. Maybe they got a lot of stuff to trade with, whatever it might have been. But they did not drive them out of the land. Verse 29, Ephraim, the tribe of Ephraim, did not drive out the enemy. Verse 30, Zebulun. 31, Asher. 33, Naphtali, did not drive out the enemy. Dan in verse 34. So we see this pattern where all the tribes went in, and rather than trust in God and do what they were to do by driving out the enemy, they allowed them to live in the land. And God said, all this bad stuff's going to happen if you do that. He'd warned them, He told them not to do it, but they allow it. In Judges chapter 2, the first 3 verses there, I got this rebuked by the angel of the Lord for not trusting God and driving out the enemy. This angel of the Lord says, as a result, the people would live in bondage to their enemies. It's going to be a snare. It's going to be a thorn in their flesh going forward because they didn't follow what God had asked them to do. Real quick, somebody asked, I think Sandy asked about the half-tribe of Manasseh last time. I didn't give a very good answer for that. You see Manasseh here and Manasseh here. This is the Jordan River down the middle here. We had 3 tribes that decided when they came into the land, into the valley here, Manasseh being one of them, they were a tribe that they had a lot of animals. They were shepherds, and that's what they did. And they saw this land over here and decided they'd like to have that land. And so they asked for that land early. Said, can we stay right here? And but only half their tribe decided to stay right there. The other half went on in, across the Jordan. And so they kind of divided themselves up. That's the reason there's the half tribes there of that. But anyways, so here we are, just the first chapter of Judges, we see that the people are not following and that they forgot to pass on the news of what was going on here. So Judges, really the book of Judges, what would happen is I gave you all a copy of this sin cycle, what we call this sin cycle repeats itself 12 times, about 13 actually in the book of Judges, we'll see it. But as we see this sin cycle occur, it's very simple to see. If you start over to the top, over to the left, about the 11 o'clock position, the land has rest. As long as a judge lives, they have rest. Everything's great, wonderful. We're happy. We love the Lord. And then the judge would die. There would be a pattern that would repeat here, where Israel would eventually start to become complacent. And, things are pretty good. God's blessed us. There's peace in the land and everything is wonderful. And they decide that, we don't need God as much. Everything's going okay. And so they forget about God. Next, Israel would adopt pagan practices. They begin to adopt the practices of those around them as God becomes less important to them. They depend on themselves. They start to adopt pagan practices. And then what comes with that is sin. And sin always has consequences. Sin always has pain in the end. And we'll see God would punish Israel through a conquering nation. So basically, whether it's punished or God would, like Job, He put that hedge of protection around Job. When they decide they don't need God anymore, they start sinning, start worshiping other gods. God backs away from them, and there's that, and allows these conquering armies, these other people to come in that they've allowed to live in their land, and they would start to punish them. They would start to oppress the nation. And then the people of Israel eventually would repent and cry out to God for help. And then as we go around the circle there, God would send a judge. He would raise up a judge to save His people, to lead them out of this oppression. And then once He did, the land would experience rest. Everything's back to peace. They worship God again. And then the judge would end up dying. And then we'd go right back into that cycle again. It would repeat again. And so we'll see that cycle repeat at least 12 times as we go through this book of Judges, as there is 12 judges. Also put this up here, that inner circle there, we see there is sin, servitude, supplication, salvation, just to break it down. We can look at the sin cycle and apply it to our own lives and to sin. When we sin, we become a servant of sin. Romans 6 tells us that. So we become a servant to the sin, and we cry out with supplication to God when the pain hits, and God brings salvation. But we'll see this repeated 12 times through the book of Judges. And we look at a judge. God would raise up these men and one woman to help His people. When He would do that, you think, how does a guy in a black cloak and a hammer help his people? But we know that the judges are a little different back at this time. What we think of biblically as a judge. A biblical judge is a political leader. It's a military deliverer, and really someone who is really an agent of God's power. That's really what a judge is. So he's a political leader, a military deliverer, like a general, and also he's the hand of God. He's an agent of God's power. That's what a judge is, and when we look at it. So let me go through, and we want to talk about this sin cycle. We can see it with this first person, Othniel. And Othniel is in chapter 3, verse 7. The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals. And Ashtaroth is what we'll see here. And so we see the king here of Mesopotamia rises up against the people and oppresses the people as they turn from God. And they were under his oppression for about 8 years. And then what we're going to see is God raises up this man Othniel. And Othniel will lead his people, will lead God's people into battle against this Mesopotamian king, and will win the victory. When we look at Othniel, I just want to talk about some of the unique things about each of these judges that maybe you may or may not know. And maybe we'll learn something new. What I really like, or what I really think is neat about Othniel is Caleb's nephew. So think Caleb, Joshua and Caleb. Remember, Caleb was the one who was one of the two spies that said, we can take this land. God blessed him, 85 years old. When they come back, he says, I'm as strong as I was that day. Remember, Moses promised me that I could have the country I explored, the hill country, around Debir, and that area where the giants were. And so he was given that land. Well, this was his nephew. This was his nephew. And as we go through the Judges, keep in mind that each one of these judges we speak about is in a territory of Israel. Really, Othniel is down here around Debir. So he's down around this area. And so think about this is the area he's in. So with this battle that's taking place, the people of this area of Judah, these are the ones being oppressed. And probably Simeon, that whole area, Benjamin. So that's the area that's being oppressed. So it's not all of Israel at this time. And later on we'll see like Gideon. Gideon was from Manasseh, so he's up here a little further, more the top part of Manasseh. And so that's where the story of Gideon takes place. They're being oppressed in that area, so it's not necessarily the whole nation at any given time. But Othniel was a nephew of Caleb, which is pretty neat. He's also, when you refer to Othniel, it says that he was the son of Kenaz. And that's important. I didn't mention this when we were studying Caleb. Caleb was a Kenite too, a Kenaz, or everybody say it. He was a son of Kenaz. And really what this means is Caleb and Othniel were not Israelites. They were not born of Israel. They were actually, if you looked at their lineage, they were from Esau. They were sons of Esau, sons of Kenaz. And so really what's really awesome here is they're like us. They were proselytes. They were people who chose to serve the one true God and were converts. See, they were converted into Judaism and followed the tribe of Israel and became a part of it, which is really awesome, I believe, to understand, to see that back here at this time. So we can see some interesting things about Othniel. He did teach God's laws. After Othniel rose up and helped them gain their freedom from the Mesopotamian king, there was 40 years of peace. Othniel, there's nothing bad said about Othniel. There's only one other judge that nothing bad, negative in any way was said about besides Othniel. We'll see that in a minute. And so Othniel was surely a great judge, a good person. So pretty neat. The next one we're talking about is Ehud. Ehud is an interesting fellow. Surprised we haven't made a movie about Ehud's life. Ehud was the lefty, so he was a left-handed judge. That's one way we remember who Ehud was. Ehud was a guy. This is where Eglon was the king of Moab. Remember Moab, Lot had two daughters. They had an incestual relationship. One of those daughters gave birth to a son named Moab. And so this is the evil people of Moab, the Moabites. Eglon was the king of the Moabites. And basically for 18 years, the king of Moab oppressed the people. He made them pay tribute. He oppressed them. And one day, Ehud here, the left-handed judge, was risen up by God, and he went in and basically went on a mission of his own doing here through the Lord, through the Lord. But he was the deliverer, and he went in, and the story goes, Ehud went in to see this king. This king was the Bible says that he was very fat. That's just the way it says it. And if you look at the translations, he was a very fat king. It's a very fat man is what it said, Eglon. We'll see that Ehud goes in. There's a lot of stories. Why does it say he's a left-handed judge? Why is that important? We don't know for sure. There's many different ideas out there. Some of them say that he had something wrong with his right hand is why they mention. I know later in chapter 20 of Judges it talks about 600 fighting left-handed men who could sling a stone and at a distance and hit a hare. They were, kind of reminds you of David. They were very good, but they were all left-handed. Left-handed speaks of people that are very skilled when it talks about them in the Bible. So whatever you want to look at, every way you want to go with it. It also talks about Ehud had made a dagger, a double-edged dagger that was a cubit in length, so it means elbow to the top of your finger. Remember, that's how the ark was measured. That or a royal cubit, which would be 22 inches. But it was a long dagger, we know that, double-edged, he'd made. And he strapped that to his right leg, hidden under his robes. Now, some people say the reason left-handed was mentioned is because if you come in to see the king, they're going to search you. And 90% of people are right-handed, so they would search. They wouldn't search. You draw from this way, so they would search your left thigh. They never search your right. I don't know if that's true. That's just another theory that's out there. But we do know that Ehud hid this dagger he made on his right thigh, went in to see the king, and said that I'm here to pay tribute to you from the people of Israel. So he went into the king's chambers. He offered him tribute, and before he left, he said, "Hey, by the way, I've got a secret message to you from God." And so this wicked king, this Eglon, this king of Moab, he says, "Okay." And the way the story goes, they go out onto, it sounds like a balcony, and a balcony that had doors, and it sounds like the way we can picture this in our mind. This is kind of gross, but let's say there's a water closet out on the end of this balcony. Some place to go to the restroom at out there is the way it sounds. But he took him out onto that balcony, and when Ehud got King Eglon out on that balcony, he basically said, "Here's the message from the Lord," and he pulls out that dagger and stabs him in the gut. It says the knife hilt buried into the fat, and the blood and the dirt came out. And then he shut the doors and locked them and went over the balcony and escaped. And it says that the guards outside waited outside that door until they were embarrassed, because they thought, the Bible says, basically they thought the king was on the pot. They thought he was going to the bathroom. So they waited out there until they're like, wow, he's been going to the bathroom a long time. And so they finally got the key, opened the door, go in, and there lays the fat king in his own blood, dead. And this gave Ehud enough time to escape, get back to Israel, blow the trumpet, unite the people, and says, the king's dead, let's go. And they come back and take over. And so that's how he is able to free them. And they had 80 years of rest after Ehud done this. The left-handed judge freed them. And 80 years is, basically, we look at the Bible, remember, 40 years is considered a generation. 40 years is a generation, so 2 generations is what we're looking at here that had rest because of the work of Ehud. The next one is Shamgar. Very little said about Shamgar, so we would consider him a minor. They call him a minor judge. When you think about in the Bible, we look at the prophets, the books of the prophets, and really look at Isaiah and Jeremiah. Those are huge books. They're the books of prophecy. They're prophets speaking. And so we call them major prophets because there's so much written about them. And then you look at Obadiah, there's just a little bit written about him, so we call him a minor prophet. Doesn't mean he was any less important. That's how man has decided to call them. In the same way, man has called these judges minor when there's not much written about them. Shamgar is one of those. Shamgar, Shamgar was, it says, there's a verse here, it says, after him was Shamgar, he was the son of Anath, he killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad and saved Israel. He killed 600 of these Philistines with an ox goad. Ox goad, on one end, it's an ox goad. It's something you prod the cattle with while you're plowing. It's a heavy staff. On one end, it has a sharp point to prod the oxen along. On the back end, usually they have a flat blade that they would use to scrape the plow with. It would be a formidable weapon, I would say that. But Shamgar killed 600 Philistines. Sounds a little bit like Samson, doesn't it, coming up later? Sounds like a lot of people. Did he do it all at once? When did it happen? We don't know. It doesn't say. But I wouldn't be surprised. Remember, this is the power of God working through this man. Just as Samson, the power of God worked through them. Just like Jonah. We questioned Jonah. What was the fish? Well, what kind of fish was it? It was God. The God of the universe did this. And he used a man with the power of the Holy Spirit in him to destroy 600 Philistines. What a unique thing. The next one we have is very unique because it's not a man at all. It's Deborah. Deborah was our judge here in collaboration. I'm going to say that word, collaboration, with Barak. And Deborah is extremely unique. She's also the other one that I talked about her that never had anything bad said about her. Nothing negative said about Deborah. And so Deborah is one of the judges. She was a prophetess. The Bible tells us, it says that she was a prophetess. And she was, what else is unique about her? Many things are unique about her. One of the things was that she was already preaching and teaching about God before she was raised up. Nobody else says that. We don't see that in any other judges except for her. And there's many things that can be said about her. She's never called a judge per se. She's called a mother of Israel, is what they call her, but they don't really call her a judge. They call Barak a judge, and in Hebrews 11 they call Barak a judge. But really, we see Deborah being the one that's behind this, doing the work. And the Bible never says the Spirit of God came upon Deborah. But surely she was working hand in hand with God. Now this here, we're also looking at some men. This is where Sisera is the general of this army, of a powerful army. There was a Canaanite general. So the Canaanite king had been oppressing them for 20 years. And Deborah is the one that God uses to speak. And she goes to her commander, her general, her own general, and hits Barak. And she says, surely God has risen you up to go fight against Sisera and his armies and defeat this king, this Canaanite king. And so Deborah really is the one that's behind this, telling Barak that he needs to go fight. There's a lot can be said at this time about women in the Bible and at this time and where we were at in Judges. The book of Judges, what we'll see, we start out with some pretty good judges, some good people, including Deborah, of course. But as you go through the Judges, you see the judges getting a little bit more worldly and more worldly, a little bit worse and worse. They're starting to look more and more like the world. If you notice this, it's going to level off at about Gideon. And it just keeps going downhill, though, from there. And Gideon has a lot of faults as well. Deborah's not one of those. But Deborah, why is she the one leading this? The men should have been. The men were chosen to be leaders in the faith. But it's the women here that are the ones that are leading and pushing. And even to the point where Barak, when she comes to him and says, God has chosen you to deliver us, it's time to get going after this and do it. And he says, I'll go to battle if you'll come with me. He needs her to come with him. But she says, surely the hand of the Lord is with you to go do this thing. It's been commanded, and rather than do that, he has no faith. In fact, he says, if you'll come with me, I'll go. And so she does. She goes with him, and what we'll see is this army that he's up against, they have a general. So the Canaanite king has his own general. His name is Sisera. That should have an A in it. And Sisera, he's their general. They have iron chariots there. They have 900 of those iron chariots. Israel didn't have much of anything to fight against them with, except for they had God on their side. And when they went out to fight, they were very outnumbered, 900. These are like tanks in this time, if you can imagine. And when they go to war, and Deborah later sings a song. It's what they call a song. And there's a whole chapter of her praising God and telling the story. What we can find from that is it looks like when they went to battle, God sent the rain. And it poured down heavy rain, and those tanks became hunks of iron stuck in the mud that could do nothing. And God backed, this army backed by the Lord comes in and wipes them out. And Sisera, their great commander, their general, has to flee. I will say that Barak, when Barak and Deborah are first talking about going to battle, Deborah tells Barak, you're not going to get any glory from this battle. See, the glory belongs to the Lord. It always does. And she says, Brock, you're not getting glory from this battle. I'm just going to tell you that straight up front, because the glory is going to go to another woman. And in this story, this is where we have the story of Sisera flees after his army's defeated, and he runs past a tent, and there's a lady there named Jael. And Jael says, hey, you can hide in here. She recognizes him. He runs over. He thinks she's a friend. He comes inside. She covers him up, and he says, can I have a drink of water? She gives him some milk, and he drinks that. He lays down to go to sleep, and she takes out a tent peg, puts it on his temple while he's sleeping, and takes a hammer and drives it through his head. She kills him. Jael kills the man. So now the woman gets the glory again. Started with a lady leading, and a lady finishes it, and she's the one that ends up destroying him. So that is the story of Deborah. Deborah was a wonderful leader and used of God in a mighty way. Never a thing bad said about her. She was already operating under God's oath before she ever became a judge, before she ever started leading us. Really a unique leader in many ways. Next, we would go to Gideon. And I just preached a little bit about him Sunday, so I won't say a ton about him. The Midianites, though, had been, and I will say this, this is all about the Midianites. But what we'll also see is in there, remember 2 weeks ago or so I preached about the Amalekites representing like the flesh. They're always there lurking. And God said, I'm going to wipe them out. They're an awful people. We'll see this. The Midianites were there, but the Amalekites were lurking there too, if you read that in the first part of the chapter. But anyways, it's really about the Midianites. They're the ones that were so huge. There were so many of them, and they oppressed the nation of Israel here. And it says they would plant their crops, they would get everything ready. And the Midianites, they were like nomadic, and they would come in, and they would send their army, which they said was like grasshoppers, it was like a plague. They would come in at the harvest, and here come their whole army with all their animals. And they would come into Israel, in this part of Israel, and they would just consume everything. So everything they'd grown, they just wiped them out. And they'd abuse them while they were there and oppress them. And then they would leave. See you next year when you grow your crops again. We're going to come and wipe everything out again like a plague of locusts. That's what they were like. This was going on for 7 years. The people cried out to God. See, they had, but if you read before this, with the cycle had happened. They walked away from God. They didn't need God anymore. They started to worship idols. And this is what's happened. God takes away his hand of protection. And here comes the Midianites. The people cry out for help. God hears them from heaven and raises up a man named Gideon. When we find Gideon, where do we find him at? He was down. He wasn't threshing his wheat where he should have been up in the high place. He was down in the wine press because he was hiding, because he didn't want the Midianites to come along and see him threshing the wheat, because they'd steal it. That's what they would do, and consume it. So he was hiding out. When the angel arrives to tell him that he's been called of God to be raised up as a deliverer, he says, "Who am I? My family is small. We're Manasseh. We're the smallest tribe in the area, and I'm nobody. Who am I? And besides that, where have you been?" Is what he says. Where's God been? I've heard about these miracles. Why are we being so oppressed? And that's when the angel says, but surely you're the one that's going to deliver. He's here now, and he's chosen you to raise up. And you can go in this might and valor of yours. We won't see a lot of might and valor necessarily in Gideon as he goes forward at first. We're going to see a lot of things. This is one of those characters that we look at. We learned all about him when we were real little in Sunday school, right? But we learned the Sunday school stories about Gideon. And as we grow, we need to look at some of the truths behind the story of Gideon. Gideon was a guy who really questioned God. He measured God by looking at his own abilities, not God's. And so that's where we see him kind of failing here. Is a lack of faith, a great lack of faith in God. He says, "If I found favor in your eyes, then show me a sign," he says to the angel. And he does, and the angel does show him a sign. He brings him some food, says, "Set it on the rock." He sets it on the rock, he touches it. It's consumed by fire that goes up into heaven. The angel disappears with it, poof, right before his eyes. And Gideon says, "Oh my goodness, surely this really was an angel." And he goes from there. He says, "Now here's the thing I want you to do, is go tear down your father's. Your father has set up these altars to Baal and Ashtaroth. I want you to go tear them down and put an altar to God in its place instead." And so he does do that, but he does it by night. He's scared of the people. He has a real problem there. Like I said, he measures God by looking at his own abilities, not God's abilities. But he does do it. And if we look in Hebrews 11, that's that place where we see the hall of faith, these great men of faith. Gideon's there, and Gideon does show he does show faith here eventually, but he does have some problem with it. It says that Gideon was covered by the Spirit of the Lord. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him. He calls people together to do this thing, to raise up against the Midianites. And the people come to him. 135,000 is what he's going to be up against. It's a pretty big number of people. He's got 32,000, I think, on his side. 135,000 Midianites to his 32,000 Israelites in the beginning. And they do come to him, those 32,000 men. But what we'll see here is Gideon goes out and does that thing with the fleece. Remember that? He gathers the nation, but he's like, okay, God, one more thing. Just real quick. He said, I'm going to lay a fleece out tonight. If I wake up in the morning and the fleece is wet but the ground is dry, I'll know that you're really calling me to do this thing, that we should really do this. And so God humors him. God does that thing. And then Gideon says, he gets up in the morning, that's the way it is. God has done it. He's like, wow. But he questions God again the same night. He says, God, if you'll do it, but you'll reverse that and make it dry and the ground wet, then I'll know. And I'll know it's you. There was a story I read about a guy a young guy was a young preacher was in seminary in college, and he was dating a girl. Things were getting very serious. He was even considering proposing to her. But he ended up taking a towel out and putting it outside and said, God, if I'm to marry her, in the morning, would you make that wet? Make that wet, but the ground dry or something, whatever. And I forget how that went the first. I guess what it would have been. But anyways, he goes to bed that night, and it pours down rain all night. And so he's like, well, I've got my answer. And he goes out the next day, and he went to look for his towel, and he couldn't find it. And then somebody parked their car over top of it. So it was dry. Whatever the answer was, the answer to him in his mind was, oh, God's telling me to break up with her. So he did, which was probably good for her. Because that wasn't okay. It's not okay to do that. And that's the way this story goes. But there's many Christians that one of my childhood pastor, who I love and was a great man of God, he tells a story about being on the back of a boat. He was in the Navy, and he knew he was being called of God to preach. And he's on the back of that boat somewhere in the Pacific, and he's looking up in the night sky, and he says, God, if you want me to preach, would you just make a falling star shoot? Just one star, And it doesn't happen, but he becomes a phenomenal preacher, still is. And God uses him in my way. We're not to, what did Jesus say? We're not to test the Lord our God. We're not to try him. It says that, he got that from Deuteronomy. I think it was Deuteronomy 6 where that came from. But you don't test your God. And so anyways, but Gideon says, okay, goes this. We know the Midianite army was huge. It was massive. And you know the story. And I just told these numbers, just talked about it. God ends up reducing that army because, if it was already going to be ugly. 135,000 men against Israel's 32,000. But if they were to defeat that, what it would look like was Israel did a great thing. Gideon did a wonderful thing here. and God helped them. But you know how the story goes. God says, tell anybody that's scared or afraid, that's sore afraid, to go home. And 22,000 men went home. And so that made the odds a little bit different. So we started out at 4-1. That went to 13-1 after those 22,000 went home. So I've got to kill 13 men before I die, if we're going to win this thing. But God said that's still not fair, because if it happens, people will still say there's 10,000 Israelites against 132,000. They might still say, boy, Israel's tough. And they may fail to mention God. And so that's why God reduced them down. They drank out of the spring, and whether they bowed down and lapped like dogs, or whether they scooped it like this and drank, that's how he weeded it down to 300. A lot of people say, the Bible doesn't say, so we can just guess. And some people say that the men that scooped, and this is in the NIV and the King James, will say that the ones that scooped and drank were the ones that were chosen. And a lot of scholars say that's because if you lay out here lapping like a dog, you're not seeing anything. But the guys that do this are cautious. So now they can see their enemy approaching. And so that's why he chose them. I don't know what the reason, because it's not given. It makes sense, but there's no reason like that given. Well, the real reason is because God intends to have the glory. That's the real reason why he done this. And so he weeds it down to 300 men. Gideon still questions God after this. And God allows him again. He sneaks down in the camp. Remember, and he hears those Midianites talking. And like, man, I had a dream last night. And we were being destroyed. I know it was Gideon. He's going to kill us. We're all going to die. And that further bolstered Gideon's faith, I guess you would say. But Gideon did follow through with God. And he did follow God, and he did do this thing with 300 men. So it did take a lot of faith to do that. Gideon, remember they had the pots with the torches inside it. They spread their men all out on the hillside. They busted them pots open and shouted to the Lord when it did. And it looked like lights are coming on everywhere, and they're hearing the shouting. God put that spirit of confusion into the Midianites. They started busting out of the camp, started killing each other. And all Gideon and his men had to do was pursue them along the way and pick up the treasure once it was done, the loot. I will say that Gideon, just to speak a little bit more on him, Gideon did do some things of faith, but Gideon did mess up in the end at some point. And he's kind of up and down. But you will see that he says, the men ask him, they said, won't you rule over us? Won't you become our king? You and your kids and your kids' kids. They want him to be king and his family to be king. And he said no. And it sounds really good. He says, I will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. And that sounds wonderful. It sounds like he's really making the right decision there. But then he adds, let me make this one request of you. And he says these Midianites would wear a gold earring. And he said, I know you guys all took them as part of the loot and the bounty. I want them. Would you give me those? And, oh, of course. They do anything for Gideon. And so they gave him those gold earrings, and he takes those and he makes a golden ephod, a solid golden ephod, which is the thing the priest wears. Now, why he done that, I have no idea, but they said that became a snare to Gideon and his family. He puts it in his hometown, becomes a snare. More than likely what we see is that people come there to worship that. It was just another idol. Israel does not need any help in the idol department, and so they come and worship that. A couple other things. Gideon sounds like he's doing the right thing. I'm not going to be your king. No, not me. But if we look at him, do you know when he busted those lanterns open, when they busted that pot and the torch was there and all that happened, he told them to yell out loud, behold the sword of the Lord. Yell for the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. He had him yell that. He threw that in. So the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Why did he throw his name in there? But he did. He threw his name in there. And I will tell you this too. This next one we're going to talk about, well, I don't know if I put him up there. Okay, I got to talk about him because there's lots on here. But Abimelech was his son. He married lots of wives. He had 70 sons. Now, that sounds kingly. It sounds like somebody who's acting like a king to have 70 sons. And he had many wives and concubines, so he marries. He has one particular son that was born to him by a concubine, and his name, he calls him Abimelech. And Abimelech is actually, the name Abimelech is more of a title, and Abimelech means my father is king. And that's what he named his own son. So that's kind of telling there a little bit as well. Abimelech, Abimelech is not up here because he's not a judge, but he's in here a lot because he caused a whole lot of trouble. He went back, Abimelech ended up growing up and making himself king. He believed he was king, and he tried to make himself king of a small portion here of the area. And when he does this, he ends up killing his brothers. So 69 of his brothers are killed. He kills them himself on one stone. One brother escapes out of that whole deal. And Abimelech, he ruled over that portion of Israel for 3 years as their king. And he ended up causing a whole lot of problems, a whole lot of trouble. He's the guy, if you remember, was even warring against the very people of Israel. He had some problems with his own people, and he went up against the tower. Remember that he's the one that went up against the tower, and the lady in the tower, there was one lady in the tower that got hold of a chunk of a millstone and dropped it off the tower, and it landed on Abimelech's head and busted his skull, and he was going to die. And he had one of his armor bearers said, would you kill me? Because I don't want people to know a woman killed me. But now we all know that a woman killed him. Everybody knows it. It ended up happening, but he was killed by a woman. That's him. I'm just throwing him in there because there's a lot said about Abimelech. He caused a lot of problems. But here's what we're seeing. The people of Israel, we had somebody like Othniel and Deborah and some of these that were really wonderful and followed God and would bring the people back to a place. Now what we're seeing is now after Gideon went 40 years of peace, we did have a long time of peace, but we're seeing the people, Gideon wasn't so great, was he? I mean, when you really get right down to it, as far as being a godly man, and we're just seeing we're starting to go downhill with our judges and our people as a whole. And so anyways, we go on with, and he was not a good guy. We go on with this next one is Tola and Jared. These would be minor prophets. And we look at Tola and Jair. They departed from God right after his death. He ruled 40 years, or he was, but right after he died, they turned away from God just shortly right after, as the Bible says. And this first one here, Tola, he rules about 3 years. And I did put in there a little bit about Abimelech. Yeah, so Tola did serve the longest of the minor judges, 23 years. He isn't really a military leader, but he's more of a political leader and gets the people to come to peaceful terms. And but not a lot said about him other than that fact that he did do a lot. Little is said of him. Jair followed, and he served for 22 years. Jair, the only thing we can say about Jair is he had 30 sons. So in his time, he had a lot of kids. And there was 45 years of peace under Jair, but he's a very minor prophet. Not much said about him at all. I had a note on him, I thought. Anyways, I know in chapter 10 here, let me bring this fact out. They're going through this sin cycle. We see them, they come to peace, the prosperity, things are wonderful, things are great. We love God. And then we start to, when you're wealthy and you don't need God all the time, you start to look around and you become complacent in worshiping God and you start to idle. We see that sin cycle start to take over. And as they come to a place where they're oppressed by another nation, they'll cry out to God, and God always is there for them and raises up. Well, here, I want you to notice in Judges chapter 10, there's a time here in around verse 10 or so when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, saying, "We have sinned against you because we have forsaken our God and served the Baals." And the Lord, he says to the people of Israel, "Did I not save you from the Egyptians and from the Amorites and the Ammonites, Philistines?" He goes through a whole list there. He said, "I saved you out of their hand." But he says, "Yet you have forsaken me and served other gods, therefore I will save you no more." He says, "I'm done. I will save you no more. Go and cry out to the gods whom you have chosen. Let them save you in your time of distress, in your time of need." He says, listen, he says, "Won't you go let that log you carved and poured some gold over save you this time? I'm tired of it." He says, "You come to me asking every time this comes, every time you get in problems, you haven't served me, you go chasing after these other gods. Let them other gods save you this time." And really what's going on is because these people had not got rid of their gods. The people of Israel at this point were not coming to him authentically asking. What had happened here, and you've seen this a lot. They had their fingers crossed behind their back when they come to God this time. They weren't coming to him authentically asking to be saved and like they were going to change. They were not changing their way. See, what had happened was they weren't repentant of their sin. They were upset because they got caught in their sin. See, and now they were paying the price. I know we know people. We may have been in that position before. We get caught and say, we're not really repentant. We're upset because I got caught. And so God says, you know what? He knows their heart, and he says, you let your God save you. Because, see, they hadn't given up their gods. They were holding them behind their back going, "God, save us." But on their shelf at home was those idols. And God says, let them save you. And then we'll see here as it goes on, they admit they've sinned. They say, whatever seems right to you, God, do that thing. They ask him to please deliver them. And they give up their gods. And then that's their repentance. See, they come in honest, authentic repentance then. And when that happens, then God sends the deliverer. And this next deliverer he sends is really unique. Jephthah. And I done a whole Wednesday night on him one time. He is a character. Now, I'm telling you, this guy, I'm surprised we also haven't done a movie on this one. He is quite a character. When you think of Jephthah, think Wild Wild West. That's how I think of Jephthah. And it is kind of neat. Jephthah was a mighty warrior, but he was the son of a prostitute. And his father had all these other kids, these other sons, but he went out and cheated and had a prostitute, got her pregnant, and she gave birth to this son named Jephthah. And he grew up in Dad's house, but when they got older, the other sons chased him out. They cast him out and said, "You're not having a part of my dad's inheritance because your mom is not our mom. Your mom was a prostitute. You're not worthy." And they chased him off. And he went down and lived in the country below. And it says they lived in the land of Tob. And it says, but he was a charismatic man. And I think wilderness, think wild, wild west. When he lived down, it said there's many translations say like worthless men or like vagabond men. These men, other men that had been outcast, gather themselves to Jephthah. And he starts leading around like a posse. And he's strong and he's mighty. And he was a mighty warrior. And when things got ugly in Israel, the people of Israel, from this very town, his very brothers, these people, they know how tough he is. And they go down there to Jephthah and say, would you help us? Would you deliver us? And this is of God. God chooses him. God's Spirit comes upon Jephthah. But Jephthah is an outlaw. He is literally an outlaw. But he says, I'll tell you what, if you'll make me the boss, I'll come back, but I want control. And they said, anything. We know, because they thought he's the only one that can do it. And so it's quite a story. Jephthah comes back, and they make him the head over them, over Gilead, and he comes back, and he does go and fight against the Ammonites. And it was said here, one of the things to know about Jephthah is he makes a vow to the Lord. Remember he makes an ugly vow. And he says, Lord, if you'll give me these men, if you'll hand me the Ammonites in battle, and I defeat them clearly, then he says, when I get home, go after the war's over and in peacetime, whatever walks out of my house, I'll dedicate it, I'll sacrifice it to you. In the name of the Lord, I'll put it on the altar, I'll sacrifice it to you. And we know that God did this thing. He gave him them great victory. And when he went home in peacetime, he walks over the horizon, walk into the house, and instead of the chicken or the cow coming out of the house or the goat, it's his only daughter comes running out of the house. Happy, gleeful that dad's home. And he just about dies right there. The way the story goes, he had no sons. He only had this one daughter. And he loved her. And he made this irrational vow. And remember how important vows and covenants are to this time period, to these people. It was just something he could break. He made a vow to God himself of this. And at the time they did, the animals would live in the home with you. You bring them in the home. And so he probably in his eyes thought a chicken's going to run out, or a goat, or a sheep, or something. But his daughter runs out. Now, use your own judgment on what you believe happens. But it says that he tells her what's happened. She said, be it unto me as thou hast vowed to the Lord. She succumbs to this and says, hey, she acquiesces. Whatever you've said, you made a vow to God. You can't change it, Father. And she said, but only let me do this one thing. Let me go up into the mountains for a couple of months and mourn my virginity with my friends. And that's what she does. She goes up in the mountain, mourns her virginity, it says, and comes back down. And then it says that he did according to his vow unto his daughter. So God would never and has never condoned human sacrifice. In fact, he is completely against it. But here's the thing to consider. One of two things have happened. But did he kill her? God would not have been pleased with that. But he made this vow. Did he do it? Here's what I want you to see. You see how our leaders went from people like Deborah, who loved the Lord and was for the Lord in everything she did. Othniel, some of these great... Look at the leaders who were coming. Jephthah was really an outlaw. He made a horror. Why would he even offer that? See, he didn't know the Bible. He didn't know the Lord's heart, because he never would have offered to sacrifice, with the thought of that being his daughter. Would he have carried this out? It was going on all around him. That was one of the sins of the people that they were supposed to dispose of, was they sacrificed their children. So did he do it? I don't know. Because one of the other things that we see is a lot of people believe that basically she was sentenced to a life of celibacy. So his young daughter could never marry and could never have children. It was his only daughter, so his lineage was done with her. So that's why she went up in the mountains to lament and mourn over her virginity, because she would never be able to have children. So some people say they think that's what happened. I don't know. That's up to you. The Bible doesn't clearly say it. It sounds like it clearly says that he did what he did, but that makes sense too. So you can go with whatever you want to believe on that. After Jephthah, we have some other minor judges, Ibzan, and these guys. There's not a lot to be said. Ibzan had 30 sons and 30 daughters, and protected Israel for 7 years. Elon judged 10 years. He was used by God. He stopped increasing the paganism at least. Abdon judged 8 years. He was very wealthy and influential. He had a huge family as well. These judges were over about 31 years. The entire book of Judges spans about 400 years. So we're going through 400 years from start to finish here in looking at all this. The last but not least is Samson. I'm going to run a little bit over Samson, though. was very unique. He's probably the one we know the most about, have seen the most about. Samson was a man ruled by selfish desire, by impulses. He was a man of whim. If he saw it, he just took it. That's just what he did, and he wanted what he wanted when he wanted it, and he was going to have it. He was kind of childlike in that manner. In the beginning, we look at Samson here. It says, his dad's name was Manoah, his wife was barren, and the angel of the Lord came to her and said, "You're going to have a son." But here's what's going to be unique about this son. He's going to be a Nazarite. God wants him to be a Nazarite from birth. And so he takes on the Nazarite vow. If we look at the Nazarite vow, you can find that in Numbers chapter 6. It's going to tell you in Numbers chapter 6, about verses 1 through 7, let's say, or maybe even 8. That's where you're going to find all about the Nazarite vow. The Nazarite vow is really unique. It's really neat. God tells them, and if we look back in Numbers and Deuteronomy and stuff, we see God showing us how we can come to Him, how we can worship Him, how we can be close to God. This was a people that was to be set apart, different, holy unto God, and for His use, for His special use. But God even added this: Nazarite vow was a special thing. And to me, it's kind of like fasting that we can do today. But God says, if you want to be even closer than to me. See, the Nazarite vow was voluntary. But God said, if you want to be even closer to me, then you can do this thing. And it can be for a certain period of time. It's up to you. It doesn't have to be lifetime like it was with Samson here. It can be you can say, I'm gonna pledge myself to a Nazarite vow for the next year. 2021 is going to be my year with the Lord. Or it can be a 2-month period, whatever it might be. The Nazarite vow basically has 3 major things to it. And you can go back in number 6 and look it up. Basically, what it is it says that you'll touch no unclean thing. That being specifically dead, a dead body. You'll go near no dead thing. You'll not touch the unclean thing. The second thing is that you're not to go around alcohol of any kind. In fact, you're not to go near the vine. You're not to touch the grape. You're not to touch the raisin that it becomes when it falls to the ground. You're not to go anywhere near it. God wants you nowhere near alcohol. And we've heard the stories. I don't know if you've seen it before, but there's some of the fruits, the figs, the different fruits that fall to the ground. Even around here, you've probably seen this. There's some of the apples or pears that fall to the ground and they kind of ferment and the possum gets drunk. Have you ever heard of that? A deer wobbling around the backyard? It happens. And so he said, don't even go near it. Don't even go near the raisin that's on the ground. Don't go near the vine. Drinking is out. I use this when I talk to people because I believe in total abstinence of alcohol. We as Free Will Baptists believe that. And if there's a chance on drunkenness, why would I toy with anything that might cause me to sin? I don't need it. I have no desire for it. It's not going to glorify God. There's no use in having it. But anyways, a Nazarite vow, one thing you do is stay away from alcohol of any kind. Period. The vine, don't go near it. And then lastly, the thing was you don't cut your hair. You don't cut your hair. And so when we look at Samson, he is a man of whim. And when we look at him, a man of impulses, and he could defeat 1,000 Philistines tomorrow if he wanted to, but one good-looking girl, we could defeat him in a heartbeat. He cannot pass up the Philistine ladies, just tear him up. And that's his biggest problem. And so we see what Samson does as we see, and his life, so I'm not going to go through every little detail. What I really want to talk about is how he came down in the end. What happened to him? He early on, it says he was very rash. That says up there. I like that. That was actually talking about him one time. I didn't go on. Sorry, Samson. He was very rash too. Yeah, there it is. Very rash and conniving. He done so many amazing things. But do you know what happened at the beginning of Samson? One of the first things we'll see is that this is the one guy that they're being oppressed by the Philistines, and they don't cry out for help. The Israelites, you'll notice, they don't cry out for help at this time. They're not even turning to God at all in this one. But God sees their oppression. He hears those cries, and He sends. He raises up this man from birth. He raises up Samson to deliver his people, even though his people haven't even cried out for help this time. And Samson did judge them for 20 years. Sexual sin was, of course, his greatest downfall. And we'll see that how did he end up fall into this Nazarite vow. One day he was going down. He saw a woman. He saw a Philistine woman. And what did he tell his dad? this is the first sign of this. He said, I saw one of the daughters of Philistine at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. And it says right below that, he says, get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. Now, does that sound like a man who has learned about her hopes and her desires and her dreams and what she wants to do with her life? And, does she want kids? No, he saw her and she looked good and right in his eyes. Now go get her for me as my wife. And that's the man of impulse. That is what we see in Samson. This doesn't sound like a godly judge at all, but look at where we've come. We, as the people as a whole are becoming something that they should never have become. God said this would happen. We look at him as we go on through his life. There's a day when he's going down to see this woman, is going to be his wife, and he runs into a young lion. And it says that he takes that lion, he actually kills that lion with his bare hands. He kills that lion, goes down to see her. Later on, he's coming down that same way again, and he goes off the path to see the lion. He's kind of proud of his trophy that he had killed, evidently. And when he goes to look at the lion, all he finds is the rib cage and the bones. And there's a bee's nest has taken over in that rib cage. It's hanging in that rib cage. And it says that he goes and takes some of the honey. Now, when he does that, what is he doing? He's touching the unclean thing. He's touching that dead animal. So strike one in doing that. The next thing that we'll see him do is, it says that when he's going to marry this woman, it says he went down, Samson prepared a feast for the young men as they used to do. And that word, and I wrote down here in the Hebrew, that word is mishtah. That word for feast is mishtah. And that Hebrew word really means drinking party. It's a drinking party. And there's no way around that word. Mishtah means drinking party. And Samson's the one that prepared this feast. It looks like he's participating in a drinking party. That'd be strike two. We know he has nothing left on his Nazarite vow but his hair. And that's where, after his first wife is taken from him, another time he goes in. It talks about he finds a prostitute. He goes in, sees her and lays with her, and then that's where he takes the gates of the city. They try to trap him so many times. He killed and defeated so many men, used by the power of God. God still uses him. He doesn't look like a real worthy man. God uses him as an instrument, to deliver his people, even though they didn't ask for it, but they needed him. They needed God, and they needed a man like Samson. And God used Samson as that instrument to do this thing. Lastly, he meets Delilah, and she's a trickster from the start. Eventually, he does tell her, he tells her that where his power lies is in his hair. That's all he had left. And when they cut those 7 locks of his hair, they've been growing all his life, his power was gone. And they took him, the Philistines took him and gouged out his eyes and threw him in prison. And he became a person of ridicule. We know when he was in that prison, it says, he found humility, didn't he, right off the bat? He found humility in that prison cell. And it also found, the Bible tells us, that not after he was put in there, his hair began to grow. And God blessed him. He asked him when he was brought out to be made fun of and ridiculed, look, we've got Israel's champion. The Philistines brought him into their temple in one of their big drinking party celebrations, one of their mishtahs, mishtu, M-I-S-H-T-E-W. And they brought him out, they put him between the pillars, and he said, God, if you'll just give me the strength one more time. And he pushes those pillars down, and more people are killed in that last thing than it happened in all of his life, to be killed by the edge of the sword. After Samson, it does go on. There's a few stories here, and what we'll see is civil war among the people. We'll see one group of people beating up on another, and we'll see one story. I told this recently. Remember the story about the man that's traveling, and he goes to Gibeah, and he has his concubine went looking for her, found her, brings her back, and he stops in Gibeah. And remember, he goes inside, and all the people of Gibeah, the men show up and want to have homosexual relations with the man. They're beating on the door. It sounds a lot like Sodom and Gomorrah. God's people, Israel, sounds just like Sodom and Gomorrah in this story. Remember, they put out they gave them the concubine, and the next day they found her, she crawled up to the door sill. Remember that story? She just made it to the door sill, and she was dead. And he cuts her up and sends her to the people as a testimony. And the people unite and go to war against these others. And, oh my goodness, civil war. Civil war in Israel. And these are God's people. What is going on? And all kinds of ugliness. But here's what I'll tell you. In the end, this is how the book of Judges. If you want to sum up Look at the very last verse of the book of Judges, and then I'll sum it up. The very last verse in the entire book of Judges says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. You know, they didn't do what was right in God's eyes. They did what was right in their own eyes. And therein lies the problem. They had turned into just a place where there was wickedness, and there was sin, and there was bad. And that's the verse that describes Israel. When we leave off at Judges, this is where we're at. And if this story, we'll go to Ruth next, but we're going to really pick up in 1 Samuel, and we'll see right off the bat. Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, they're sleeping with women they're priests, and they're sleeping with women and stealing the food at the temple. You know, this is where we found ourselves, because everyone's doing what's right in his own eyes. But God's getting ready to raise up the last one that's going to be a judge, and that's going to be Samuel. He'll raise him up, and things are going to get a little bit better here for God's people. So that is it. That is the book of Judges. I think I did go a little bit over. I apologize for that, but it's hard to get through the book of Judges.